Right, so a very warm welcome, everybody. Welcome to everybody who has joined in person and to our online audience. I'm delighted to welcome you to this first out of a series of research talks that's going to happen in the department over the course of the first semester. My name is Dimitri. I am a senior lecturer in media and international politics in the department and also director of research. And I will be the moderator of today's panel, which will look at the exciting topic of researching and countering mis and disinformation. Now, this topic is one of the topics in media communication, which is a mysterious one, I would say, because there are lots of myths about mis and disinformation, as well as many undiscovered truths. So in a sense, the panel that we're going to have today is both about uncovering those myths and uncovering those truths. So we're going to discuss a series of questions over the next 45 minutes, and this will be followed by the Q&A from the audience. So please have your questions ready. There will also be an opportunity for the online audience to ask questions. You can do that by leaving comments to our YouTube video. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our panelists today. So all of us are from the Department of Journalism Studies, University of Sheffield, and many of you will be familiar or will be becoming familiar with us in some capacity over the next year. So welcome to Dr. Bina Ogbibor, who is lecturer in journalism studies. Dr. Bina has worked as a TV reporter, producer, and news editor for several years before joining academia. And she is very well known for her research on press reform, on media policy, and media and democracy. And recently, Bina has been conducting research into COVID misinformation, the infodemic, and the online communities in Africa. We are also joined today by Dr. Danny Madrid-Morales, who is our lecturer in journalism and global communication. Danny's research is centered around the study of global political communication, as well as international media flows, particularly with a focus on the global south. Danny has been studying the geopolitics of disinformation in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly from the perspective of audiences. And his latest co-edited book is called Disinformation in the Global South, and I invite you all to the launch of that book in November. So we will have a separate, big, proper-sized discussion of the book. And finally, Danny also helps curate disinfoafrica.org, which is a website that brings together research on mis and disinformation in Africa. We also have Dr. Irini Katsaria on our panel, who is our reader in international media law. Irini is an expert in international, European, EU law and comparative media law, and has published extensively in these areas. Irini has also conducted research into the issues of press regulation, regulatory uncertainty, fake news, and the new online media. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Ilya Yablokov, who is our lecturer in journalism and digital media. Ilya's sphere of research interest includes mis and disinformation, conspiracy theories, international broadcasting, and also the journalistic practices of self-censorship, particularly in post-Soviet states. He has explored Russian state disinformation and has published monographs entitled Russia Today and Conspiracy Theories, and also Fortress Russia. So thank you to all the panelists for joining us. As a first task to all panelists, I asked them to surprise us, to talk about an exciting piece of research about mis and disinformation that they conducted recently, and particularly to think about how and why disinformation matters, and how can we find solution to real life challenges and consequences of mis and disinformation through research. So we'll start with Danny. Danny, over to you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this rainy afternoon. So when Dimitri asked this question, I thought the best way to approach it was to start with a full-on clickbait headline, so that you all stay here at least for the next 5 minutes to get the answer, right? So my clickbait headline is that media literacy is useless, and click here to learn why that's the case. And for me to be able to develop this sort of headline that I am leaving you with, and please do not tweet this headline because there's a catch at the end of the whole story, right? I wanted to bring all of you to a project that I just recently completed in South Africa. I I came back a few weeks ago from spending a month traveling across South Africa with a colleague of mine at the University of Cape Town, where we were trying to understand how do young people consume information. And that might be a topic that has been quite well researched, but we thought, are there any specificities of the South African case that we can learn from? And how do people engage with information in the era of widespread disinformation? So we spent time traveling around different provinces in South Africa. We went to some rural communities. We spent some time in big cities. For those of you who might not be familiar with the South African case, let me give you a little bit of a background on why South Africa is actually quite an interesting case. When we all here started talking about disinformation and fake news, it was probably around 2016 when Donald Trump, who you all may know, decided to call everything that he didn't like fake news. And at that point, not all of us, because some of us had been doing research on this topic for quite a while, but there was a boom in interest in what fake news is and so on. However, for some countries like South Africa, fake news was an issue way before Donald Trump created the term or reused the term fake news. So South Africa, for example, was one of the first countries that had political consultants manufacture fake stories to help the party in government. In the case of South Africa, it's a party called ANC, the African National Congress. South Africa was actually a good example as well on how state sponsored media or state-owned media, national broadcasters, are also quite strong in the dissemination of disinformation. For a long time, the national broadcast in South Africa, called SABC, was captured or monopolized by the ruling state. And through that channel, disinformation was spread by politicians quite widely. Also, South Africa has been dealing in the last few years with a widespread case of xenophobic violence that spread particularly on social media. And all of that had to do with rumors that were blaming foreigners for a lot of the violence that was happening in South Africa. So South Africa is quite an interesting case in the sense that disinformation has been happening for quite a while, and it has been happening in multiple aspects of society. So for this specific project that I wanted to discuss today, we conducted a series of group discussions in many African countries, South African cities and small towns, where we tested how useful it is to teach young people about media literacy. And I'm going to assume that most of you can understand what the term media literacy means. And I will not spend too much time with it, but for those of you who might not have heard the term, media literacy tends to refer to a set of skills and knowledge that's going to help us, media users, be more critical readers of the media, be aware of the biases of the media, and so on. So what happened with this project is we went to these communities and we had lecturers teach a lecture on media literacy. So we delivered some materials where students learn about different types of disinformation, how the media can have biases in their reporting, and what happens when those biases exist. And the reason why we're doing that is because we thought that teaching that kind of material would make people more resilient to disinformation, right? If you teach people and make them more aware of the dangers of falling for disinformation, maybe they will become more critical consumers of the media. However, and that's where my clickbait headline from the beginning goes to, the outcome of that project was slightly different from what we expected. And we found that a lot of the people that we were teaching this kind of content, so when we were going to classrooms and we were teaching them, hey, you should be a bit more critical of the media, instead of turning or helping students develop sort of critical skills, we turned them, or a lot of them, into cynical readers of the media. That is, people who distrusted the media a lot more than before they were exposed to some of these training materials. So what happened was that some of them were aware of some of these things that we were teaching them, but they hadn't thought about them very deeply. And when you expose them to some of these ideas, say, oh, be careful with some media content because journalists might have an ultimate goal in what they are broadcasting. Hey, be careful with certain media sources because they might not be unbiased. So when these young people were made to think about these processes, instead of reading the media critically, they became very cynical and detached from the media, which was obviously not the outcome that you were expecting from training like this. So why do we think that some of these things were happening? And that doesn't mean that if we apply the same logic to the British case, we would end up with the same outcome, right? But we thought that there were three specific instances that were happening in South Africa that help explain why people were becoming more cynical instead of more critical. One of them was a long trend in South Africa towards being disengaged with the media, being disengaged with news content, being disengaged with politics. And that's something that we see particularly in the youth in South Africa. People have seen the political elite stay in power for many years. The ANC, the party I was talking about before, has been in power since apartheid, the end of apartheid in 1994. So it's been in power for 30 plus years and therefore has monopolized power in the country. Second reason that was important was that people already had low levels of trust in the media before the whole process started. A lot of coughing today. I'm going to hope that there's no COVID circulating in the room. You'll talk about COVID in a bit, so that's going to be a good segue. But there was general distrust in the media before, and our materials, unfortunately, may have triggered that distrust to be more prevalent. And finally, probably the most important takeaway of this project was that a lot of the content that we were teaching might have been failing, not so much because students were reading it in the wrong way, but because actually the people who were delivering those lectures were unable to deliver the content in the right way. So if I say at the beginning that media literacy might be useless, in a part, it might be the case, but there's some reasons why that might be useless. And one of them might be that we're delivering content to people that might not be very receptive to that kind of content, but also those delivering that content might not be properly trained. And probably when we ask another question later on, Dimitri, I can elaborate a bit more on how we can make media literacy more relevant. But I'll stop here for now and let my colleagues share their insights now.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Danny. And I certainly have questions about what is the right way then, but we will save those questions until we go into full discussion mode. So thank you, and Dina.
Yes, thank you very much, Dimitri. So I'm going to talk about a study I did on COVID-19 infodemic in Nigerian WhatsApp communities. What that means is at the peak of the COVID-19 infection, we found out that there was so much information on WhatsApp, and we were receiving messages. For example, myself, I belong to lots of WhatsApp groups of Nigerians from different countries, and I could just receive like 3 messages from different countries, the same message, and they're all incorrect against the World Health Organization's facts on COVID-19. So there was so much information out there. So myself and a colleague in University of Maiduguri, Nigeria, decided to do something about it, to look into it, to find out who are the speakers in this space and who are the ones that are dominant, which of them is dominant, what are the subjects, the themes they're talking about. And we also looked at the perspective. So we had to interview people to find out what people felt about these messages they were receiving. One thing that was interesting to me is that I realized that putting people or putting the different messages into different classifications, that's disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theory, however, wasn't as simple as I thought it would be. So when we went into the research, we had collected so much. We had, initially we had over 1,000 messages, but there were so many repeats. By the time we removed all of them, we just had about 432. When we went into them and we started putting them into different classifications, we found out that there were some that we couldn't really say whether they were misinformation. It would be too simplistic to describe them as such. So the research kind of decided that there should be what we call gray area. Why we said that is this. I'll give an example. So there was this belief that COVID-19 is not airborne. At some point, so the World Health Organization, which I use as my facts to compare the different data, the World Health Organization at some point said COVID-19 is not airborne. They tweeted that. And then because of that information that COVID-19 is not airborne, a lot of people argue that you don't need to wear face masks, leave them for the doctors. And there was a lot of campaign that you shouldn't buy these face masks, leave them for doctors. It's not necessary. And so at that time, people that started producing, they produced videos, audios, different things. They put them in these spaces. Why, like the close communication space, like WhatsApp, that you know that just for people, maybe they're your friends, people that connect with you. There was so much of this in this space. But later on, after a while, about July 2020 period, the World Health Organization kind of amended that information because a lot of studies had gone on, people argued about it, and they kind of, in one of the definitions, inferred that it was airborne. And so we now said, okay, so where do we class the people that have shared the information that COVID-19 is not airborne? Will you call that misinformation? It was a fact from the World Health Organization at that time. And if we just say this is misinformation, it doesn't give a very clear picture of the whole thing, what happened. So we came together and we just thought that there should be a gray area when it comes to emerging infectious diseases like COVID-19 and you have other diseases, that when people are studying these things, you shouldn't just have just misinformation and disinformation. There should be something like a gray area because emerging infectious diseases means they're just coming, isn't it? They're just coming. So it's not everything that's known. Studies are still going on about them. So things change. Some things can move from being misinformation, so to say, to become a fact, just like it happened with the airborne thing. So it's important that when studies are going on like this, it's important to create another area. It's not always easy to say this is misinformation and this is disinformation when it comes to emerging infectious diseases. And then we noticed this gray area thing again in some other aspect. For example, things about taking herbs. In a lot of the Nigerian WhatsApp messages, there were a lot of messages on taking ginger, mixing them with garlic, and all those things. And when we look at a lot of literature, background literature on them, we saw that they are immediately classed as misinformation. But when we interviewed some of the people that shared these messages, not all of them, but some of them, in fact, most of them said they did not say it was a cure. They said it was building immunity. And some of them that we interviewed felt that people weren't listening. In fact, they said a lot of people in the West don't listen to us. They just brand what we say as misinformation. And if they brand what we say as misinformation, it's not easy for us to listen to them because we feel they don't trust us. They don't listen to us. So we got a kind of message among them to say that said, you're not listening. You need to listen to us before you brand what we say as misinformation. So what we are saying is that these things are good for the health. So we are trying to build our immunity. And so you shouldn't say it's misinformation. So that's another thing we noticed from what people said. A lot of them said, no, listen to us. We are saying this builds immunity. Then another thing we noticed that was really interesting was the opinion leaders. The opinion leaders in that space, we found out that entertainers were dominant. It was interesting that it was on COVID-19 infodemic, and we expected to see more of health, for example, but we found that most of the things that were shared were from entertainers. Now, about 21 point something percent were entertainers top, they were at the top dominant voice in that space. And most of them were promoting facts that were, or things that were against the COVID-19 facts, what you would describe as misinformation or disinformation. Most of them promoted these things, and those were the frequently shared information. So we wondered why should we have most of the entertainers promoting what we'll call misinformation and disinformation. But we didn't stop there. We felt that if that's the case, then it's important for health communicators to use entertainment to share messages on emerging infectious diseases. So we noticed one gap there. You may come to that again later. We noticed a gap there that a lot of the messages that came from official sources did not have entertainment in it. They were just like hard facts. Do this, do this, do that. And people weren't so interested in just the hard facts. They wanted something that was entertaining, so to speak. So, but there were some that were produced by government officials that had entertainment and they were shared. So they had some positive things, but the dominant ones were disinformation. So we just thought that if only health communicators could make their messages more entertaining, and deliberately push these messages into such close communication spaces that perhaps we'll have more correct information within close communication circles on COVID-19. So that was one thing we saw. And all right, one other thing we noticed there was misleading information on COVID-19. In fact, we did not imagine the level of globalization that had taken place, such that the COVID-19 guidelines in the UK were shared among Nigerians as COVID-19 guidelines for Nigerians. So there was a case of a guideline from Northern Ireland that was shared as a guideline. And because there was nothing showing in the poster in what was that this is for another country, no, people felt it was for that country. So I noticed that, and then someone I interviewed as well, until somebody in a platform said, no, this information is not for Nigeria, it's for another country. That was when they realized that's the extent of globalization we have now. So I think I'm going to stop now.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
I really start getting a sense of solutions emerging, but yeah, we will come to that in a few moments. So yeah, Dr. Ilya.
Yeah, thank you. So I spent the last maybe 12 years trying to dismantle how Russian propaganda works, and that's probably the year when it's about the time to to finish. But we know what happened. So I was looking first at the level of conspiracy theories that a lot of Russian intellectuals, politicians, journalists were using to provide social cohesion in Russia, and not only in Russia but in the post-Soviet world. And also, I looked at conspiracy theories as a peculiar element of popular mobilization. Conspiracy theories are not just, the stuff and ideas that only quote unquote crazy people share. We all believe in conspiracy theories. So if you find the right tone, if you find the right way of addressing the problem through this conspiratorial lens, you can actually get a lot of people gathering around you. And some of the political movements, as we know, are based on conspiratorial beliefs, not only in Russia but across the world. So when I looked at conspiracy theories, first on this level of political communication in Russia, and then slowly trying to get into the system of media and communication. So how Russian television works, things like Russian propaganda everywhere in the Western press these days, right? So I tried to figure out how these things work, and I can certainly say that today's Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, who went absolutely bananas, um, managed to create the well-working, well-oiled propaganda machine that is very efficient in mobilizing the people for tactical reasons, in particular moments of the post-Soviet history, starting from early 2000s and up until today. How this machine works, right? So we've got political communication that is based on one very clear but really powerful idea for many Russians, that the West is out to get us. What is the West is a very kind of abstract thing, but if you go to the Kremlin website today and check the speech by Vladimir Putin last week on Friday, you will see that these guys totally fixated on trying to conquer the West, trying to overthrow the power of the West in the world. The West is a menacing threat, not only for the regime, but for the whole nation. And this kind of idea was promoted by politicians, by intellectuals, but then how would that go to the majority of the population? We need to have a very well working media system, which consists of traditional media, television, radio, newspapers, book publishing, and also more recently in the last decades is the digital media, social media, Telegram channel, probably you know about it. And that system also quite works quite well. So another question which I was asking myself in my research, why does it work so well? Like, why so many thousands of people every day go to their newsrooms and produce propaganda. Because in the authoritarian regimes, as we know today, Sergei Guriev and Daniel Treisman in their book call it spin dictatorships. It's information that actually gives the power. It's information. You don't have to kill millions like dictatorships did in the 20th century. You just spin information in the right way to sustain and control the power. So you control the message, right? And in order to control the message in this propaganda machine, journalists are actually driven by creativity. They are not limited in what they can say. They can come up with anything they want, with all sorts of conspiracy theories that would drive the clicks on their websites, or increase viewings of a particular TV program. If you talk about the traditional media, right? So my interviews with journalists and media professionals show that they actually interested in producing these disinformation essentially, just to keep the ratings high. And the another reason was they are not interested in ethics. They don't have any ethical guidelines. Nothing stops them from doing that. In fact, if they do produce conspiracy theories, if they do produce disinformation, and if this disinformation becomes popular, then they get promoted or they get bonuses. So this is how the system works. But that's another one aspect of it. Now, when we think about Russia today and the levels of support of the regime and the war in Ukraine, a lot of observers say, well, you see, 85% of Russians show that they actually believe in propaganda because they say they support the government. But first of all, we need to look at the polls, we need to look at the question, we need to look at the methods which are used to monitor these public attitudes, because things are much more complex and problematic than we would have thought. So one thing that recently surprised me, and that was kind of the initial question of our session, I was asking myself, where is the limitation of propaganda? Because if you look at propaganda, if you look at conspiracy theories, they are very efficient on one level. Some conspiracy theories are extremely popular. But at some point, individuals show certain resistance to conspiracy theories. They show certain resistance to propaganda. So at what point it happens? So I asked myself, okay, what we had in the last 5 years in the Russian politics that can show a certain limitation. That was definitely the COVID-19 regulations. Again, this is something that overlaps with that. COVID-19 regulations, COVID-19 policies, which consisted of QR codes, which consist of limitations for those people who don't have vaccines, who are not vaccinated, to visit public places. So a little bit of a disclaimer: Russian government was not announcing pandemic officially. They were calling it days off, holidays, paid holidays, but there was never an official pandemic in Russia, starting from March 2020. And then in August 2020, the Russian government, Putin specifically, announced that the first COVID-19 vaccine was approved and invented by the Russian doctors and scholars. So they rolled out the program of vaccination in January 2021. And then I thought, well, okay, if they rolled it out, why starting from January 2021, there were so many protests across Russia to avoid getting vaccination, to actually protest. First time in roughly 17 years to protest the government measures. Because Russians are, according to the polls, so much believe in propaganda. They so much support it, they're so much into the content that they watch online. But when I started looking at the COVID dissident Telegram channels, what I have realized, they were absolutely not consuming, not supporting anything related to the state. The reason for that And that's kind of the working hypothesis, because this is the research I'm working on now. Uh, First of all, COVID-19 and vaccinations were that on that level. These conspiracy theories about COVID were on that level that was threatening for bodies of individuals. That's not some kind of imagined West, imagined enemy beyond our borders, imagined Ukrainian government, quote unquote, quoting Russian propaganda, driven by the Kievan junta. No, this is us. And this is us who decide what we want to do, to what extent we trust the government and experts or not. So when I looked in the COVID dissident Telegram channels and the content they produced, they actually show they were absolutely resistant to the propaganda produced by the state, produced by the Kremlin. They were not sharing them. They were critical even to the conspiracy theories that the Russian government launched at the very start of the war in Ukraine, related to biolabs in Ukraine. Probably some of you came across that. There were no mentions of these conspiracy theories in the COVID dissidents Telegram channels, which is fascinating in itself. And this is pretty much what I'm observing these days when it comes to partial mobilization of a Russian man drafted into the army. We see a lot of conspiracy theories that are aimed against the government. And that's a very interesting play when you build the propaganda machine for so many years, hoping that in the critical moment that it's going to protect your power, in fact, it's going to destroy your power. And these conspiracy theories against the government are going to be one of the instruments which is going to delegitimize the regime and probably, help topple the government.
Well, thank you, Ilya, and finally over to Dr. Irene.
So my interest, which I'm going to talk about now, is the online safety bill and the way it treats disinformation. You will have heard of the online safety bill. It's a bill that has been in discussion for a long time in this country. It seeks to regulate online harms. Its adoption has been slowed down a little bit due to the recent change in the government. But you will also have heard of the Molly Russell inquest and all the discussions around it. And this is likely to speed up the adoption of the bill. Now, one aspect of the bill that has been particularly controversial is the regulation of content that is legal but harmful, or known otherwise as lawful but awful. And one example of such content is around self-harm, as in the case of Molly Russell. Another example is that of misinformation or disinformation. So there is perhaps a perception that telling lies is something wrong, is something that is illegal even, but that there aren't enough laws or regulations around to deal with these lies. In fact, both in the UK and under the European Convention on Human Rights, the right to speak untruthfully is generally protected. So it is generally lawful to say things that are wrong or are biased or are tendentious. But of course, there are certain limits in the law, for example, in areas such as fraud or election fraud, or misleading advertising, defamation. But outside of these areas, it is not illegal to say something that is untruthful. Now, the online safety bill includes an offense, a false communication offense, which says that it is illegal to send a message known to be false with intent of causing non-trivial emotional, psychological, or physical harm to a likely audience without reasonable excuse. So this offence is not totally new. It existed already before under the Communications Act. However, the kind of the standard of culpability has changed a little, has been raised a little by requiring specific harm to be shown. However, my argument is that there are already enough laws in place to combat false information, and that we actually do not need an additional offense. And I am concerned that having an offense like that in place could be a disincentive for people to express themselves on matters that are contentious, that are sensitive. There is a protection under the Online Safety Bill for recognized publishers, and those of you who aspire to work as journalists will be perhaps relieved to hear that. But there is no such protection for so-called citizen journalists. So someone who'd like to blog or tweet on a controversial view, for example, let's say about climate change and the question whether climate change is caused by humans, or a blogger who would like to talk about President Trump's theory that COVID could be cured by injecting disinfectants, and would write about it, would they potentially risk facing a criminal liability because they might, through this tweet or blog, cause to someone some way of psychological or possibly physical harm if the message was misunderstood? The other point is that one might think that it is easy to distinguish truth from falsity, but this is not at all correct. So the lines between what is truth and what is false are very blurred. They are certainly blurred in the political domain, where it is difficult to establish what exactly is the truth. You train as journalists, you know that the understanding of truth for journalists is not a substantive one, but a procedural one. So journalists are not required to report the truth, but they are required to take care that they don't publish untruths. So this is a different standard, but the communications offense kind of implies that there is an easy line to draw between what is truthful and what is false. And we heard from Dr. Okpebo before how difficult it is to establish the truth when there is scientific uncertainty, as in the case of COVID. The online platforms have been quick to label certain criticism of, let's say, the lockdown measures as being misinformation. But this is an area where there are new insights, scientific insights have been coming in, where previously what was previously regarded as scientific knowledge was then turned upside down. So in such an area, it is especially important that there is space for people to discuss and debate and have a view on issues that are not only scientific but also political. And also the talking of truth and falsity, it is important to be aware that you can make a distinction between true and false as regards facts, but you can't do that as regards opinion. So opinion is free, and everybody's entitled to their opinion. It's not possible to label an opinion as being misinformation or disinformation. So in conclusion, I'm concerned that it will be very difficult to enforce this norm in the online safety bill. And if platforms or if Ofcom have to police speech to make a decision about what is truth or what is false, then many subjective assessments will at some point need to be made, which are kind of could even be abused for political purposes, and this is not what would be desirable. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Rini. And if I may, I'll just add one more area where the right to tell untruth should not be protected: student essays. So only truth, please, no misinformation. So, no disinformation either. So I have two more quick questions on which I'll invite your brief reflections before we turn to audience questions. One is, we've already seen a number of challenges emerge here in the discussion so far. So we have people who are turning cynical rather than critical readers. We have evolving information which itself changes. We have potentially powerful state machines pumping out propaganda and then collapsing on itself. And then we also have the lawful but awful information. So in a sense, my question is, how can and how should we counter or confront mis and disinformation? What are your views on that?
Should I go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've advocated in the past, and when I say we, is me and some of my co-authors, for what we call a socio-technical or socio-technological approach to fighting disinformation, right? Which basically means a two-front approach. One that maybe uses some of existing technology that we have available to limit the spread of disinformation, and that can include targeting certain platforms where some of this content is distributed, and that can include demonetizing content. It can include deplatforming individuals, using AI to prevent some of certain content from being spread, particularly when it comes to hate speech and hateful content. And so some of these approaches are already in place, but they are somewhat handicapped if we don't take into account the socio-economic context in which we implement some of these solutions, right? So a lot of these approaches have been tested widely in places like the UK or the US, but they might not really apply to contexts where internet penetration is lower or where people have different consumption habits, right? So in those cases, it's important to understand the context, as Ilya was saying earlier, to understand why some Russians consume certain propaganda but not others. But it also has to do with understanding how different people engage with content and information. So I think whatever approach we decide to go for, it has to be a multifaceted approach rather than a single solution, silver bullet that's going to solve the problem.
Right. Thank you. Any other reflections?
Well, I agree with what Danny just said, but I also think it's important to boost the news media, to ensure that media that are struggling have enough financial support, and also that they are findable and prominent in the online space. Also, news media need to do some work of their own to find ways to restore users' trust, and this applies, of course, to the mainstream media. Perhaps there needs to be more regulation of other online news providers, that they are also subject in some way to due diligence obligations, so that users can get more information that is accurate and trustworthy. I still have the optimism that media literacy might work, but this is, of course, a long-term solution rather than a quick fix. But I think that you, as journalists can play a big role in that, and also, of course, schools that educate children are also very important in that regard. And finally, as far as platforms go, I think it is important to know what they do with our content there. There needs to be more transparency about the way algorithms are used. We need to know how they moderate content that they consider to be misinformation or disinformation, and especially including journalistic content. The online safety bill has some protections in place for recognized news publishers. They have been very controversial, but I think it is important that these protections are in place for journalistic content.
Thank you. Lydia?
I will pick up on the penultimate point you make about the education. I think we are at the point when we need to look at more like school level of media literacy before the same guys become cynical, before they actually know what politics is. I think we need to sort of think about programs of promoting critical thinking. This is where a human being actually needs a device. And I think thinking and working and researching in that area would be something really useful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, Going on from what you said about teaching people early, I think that that's really important because, like I was saying about the opinion leaders, relating it to the COVID-19 issue, the opinion leaders within the circle of COVID-19 infodemic, we noticed that if only health communicators can identify them early, not after people have consumed so much and have taken a position. If they can be identified early in any stage of emerging infectious diseases, and they get these people and then have a kind of consultation with them and try to educate them on these things. You start early to begin to get popular people or people that have a very good communication base, and then they are now able to move out to share this information. So starting early is important. I also want to talk about algorithms. It's very controversial in the sense that algorithms can also be managed, and people have asked what's the best way to use algorithms if you want to use them to check, for example, hate speech and all that. Because some studies have come up to say there were some forms of bias even within algorithms. So the more we get into these digital checks, they become complicated in a way because you then find out that what you thought was a solution is not completely free of bias anyway. So I've moved from that media literacy to algorithm there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. And just very briefly, in literally 1, 2 sentences, if we reflect back on the field of mis and disinformation studies, what are the most urgent gaps that need to be filled? What do we need to know but do not know at the moment?
How to return trust, because it's a disinformation, misinformation word, because there is no trust in the institutions, in experts, in the powers, etc. That is something that probably will unite all of the
Yes.
speakers.
All right.
Yes. That was a major problem in the study. We found out that people did not trust the official facts. So more than half of the things that were shared discredited official facts about COVID-19 because people didn't have trust. And I think the media needs to promote different aspects when they cover like emerging infectious diseases, for example, in order to promote trust. Most of the things that were being covered on like African countries and some other were on the fact that there was distrust for the vaccine, and then some people rejected the vaccine and all that. But there wasn't so much on the economic part of it. How much did these countries provide for the people while asking them to stay at home, for example? Was there any measure? So some of the countries had the same guidelines we have in the West without similar measures to take care of the people. So political economy kind of comes in there because the people feel that it will pay them better if they don't trust you because you're telling them to stay at home and not work. You're not giving them any money. So it is easier for them to say what you are saying is not correct because that story means that they should be allowed to go back to their business and make more money. And so there's a kind of political economy of distrust there. So I don't trust you because what you are saying kills me. I don't have food to eat. So I decide not to trust you. So that's something that I think that the media needs to also look at. And even international organizations, when they say we need to do some things to check emerging infectious diseases, there should be a kind of global decision to say this is a benchmark. You need to balance health communication with economic, the lives of the people. We need to balance the two. So I think that that's something that it's a gap that needs to be looked into. I also want to say that, for example, when I talked about misleading guidelines, the fact that there's a lot of communication going on in different parts of the world means that messages on emerging infectious diseases should be labeled somewhere. You should be able to say on a poster the country that it's meant for. It's very easy to do that. Just put this message is from this country, or just put something on any message you're sending, because somebody else is going to forward that message to somebody from another part of the world. And when you spread different information to different parts of the world, it can cause a lot of confusion and problems. So that's something I think it's lacking, that the people sharing messages or health communication have not taken into consideration the fact that this is a global society and that your message you're sending to somebody within your country can be shared to people in different parts of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I'll let them ask some questions maybe before we run out of time, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I'll defer.
Okay. Right. So in that case, we have about 10 minutes for questions. So are there any questions in the audience, or are there any questions online?
There's not been as of yet. I will give another poke.
All right.
Lots of people watching.
Yeah, please.
My question is just, do you think that social media is the biggest catalyst in spreading disinformation and misinformation? Do you think things like political leaders could be more helpful because they help people now?
Who else?
Yeah. Well, for me, I think that when it comes to social media spaces like WhatsApp, for example, the community matters. I argue that when you're trying to, I'm talking about health communication because that's what I'm talking about. When you're trying to share messages, you can't have the same kind of message for every community. And they use different types of social media spaces. So, for example, in Nigeria, the most popular is WhatsApp. So it is where a lot of things, because people feel confident to share things there that they may not say before people because they have the social desirability. They don't want to be branded as spreading misinformation. But when they come to this space, they can say what they want. So I think social media is very, very vital when it comes to the spread of mis or disinformation, because a lot of people feel kind of more confident to do that. They see that as their own space to do that, while they may not do it in traditional media, for example.
I, um, I, I would think that both work in tandem because people are so distrustful of what politicians say or what the news media say. And we all know that politicians have always not been entirely truthful with us. This is why people now increasingly turn to the social media. But undoubtedly, the social media have been a catalyst for spreading misinformation and disinformation to extents unknown before.
All right. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much for the question. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. So my question is that the reality today is the opinion leaders matter more than the opinion of the truth. I mean, for example, if the people in Russia believe more in the propaganda, that means most likely the citizens have more trust into the government. While instead, that the government can may be sharing some false information in order to extend their let's say like presidentship or something like that. So my question is that is it possible that in the future we tend to believe more on what is what it should be as a truth rather than as false information? How can society strengthen their belief to not get exposed into hoaxes? Because in communication, there is a theory that is called agenda setting, where media can choose everything that is the information that they want to spread, so that it can shape the public opinion. But we also, as a public, there's a theory called user identification, where we can choose what we want to believe and what we want to reject. So instead of rejecting the information that we receive, is there any kind of like possibility to uh, differentiate which one is truth and which one is false by seeing the information? Thank you so much.
Right.
I think first question we need to ask ourselves why people believe in these things, right? Why there are so many millions of Russian citizens who wish to believe that, again, Ukraine is the enemy state, whilst there are so many people living there, their relatives, their friends, who call them and say the opposite things. Why people believe that? Is there a government? Yeah, but there's something else there. And how to make people believe in the opposite things? You need to improve the conditions in which they live, exist, and in the case of Russian survive. The disinformation that they receive, you said user gratification theory, right? They receive those bits of information that make them feel better about the country, about the society, about the government. Again, if we talk about Russia, this particular case, it is because for many years, at least 15 years, a lot of people in Russia suffered from social and economic disasters, and they've been traumatized. And when the government brings them a very nice, colorful myth that includes a lot of this information, but at the same time gives them a bit of economic perks and social promises, social policy promises, then a lot of people would believe that. And they will stick to that myth. And that's what they do these days. It's not necessarily that all of these people believe that there are fascists in the Kiev, in the Ukrainian government. No. But getting rid of this myth, thinking that, okay, I just have one national identity, I just have one team, if you wish. This is how Russian propaganda twists that. It's the team, it's like sports team, it's like football or hockey. You're part of our team loses, we cannot let it happen. But then if you start dismantling this myth, people will get very sad because economically they are not winning anymore, right? And gratifications also disappear because there is nothing there is nothing to be proud of anymore. Our community, our nation, our team completely failed, right? And so this propaganda works in this particular social, cultural, political environment conditions, right? And people will believe different things if you change these conditions, if you change the message, if you send a different message to them.
Right.
So I would say, following on from this, I would say changing the message. So it is crucial that we have a diversity of sources of information. So in order to be able to receive truth, we need to have a pluralist media, to not just have one source of information. And there needs to be dialogue even with those media that spread the untruth. So it might sound controversial, but I think, I mean, the first reaction after the Ukraine war started was for Russia to ban Western media and for the West to ban Russian media. And I think this is the wrong approach. We need to learn what other people are exposed to in order to better understand how we can open avenues of dialogue with them.
Right. Well, thank you. So we're running slightly behind, but I suggest we still take a couple more questions. So yes.
Yeah, actually, I have two questions. Both will be very specific. The first one is I have a quick check about the first example, ANC. This TV is like it run for the new president of South Africa, and he published some exact facts that do happen in South Africa. But then people get like lower its reputation and lower its owner. But what if it reported is what exactly happened? Why this people's disappointment would react to this channel ANC, and if ANC want to revise or reverse people's mind, how could they do? It's kind of the first question. And the second question is about the information gap. If we are working for journalism and we are doing for the media sense, we report what we wish to report is truth, but people see truth from different perspectives. Even in the films, if the camera is from different perspectives, people see the scenes. They have different opinions. Their own understanding will have different understanding perspectives. Then there would be a kind of information gap. If we want to let people be more neutral, think from the middle, for us, for future journalists, media workers, how could we do for them? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Anyone like to
Yeah.
address that?
I think that both of your questions connect to what both Ilya and Irene were saying before, right? So when we want to avoid these information gaps that you were talking about, or when you find this situation where politicians are discredited so much that the public will not believe anything that they say, the ultimate thing that needs to be done is go to the root causes of what's created that gap, what's created this distrust, what's created these grievances that societies have towards politicians or towards certain sources. And in every single of the cases that we've talked about today, whether it's the case of Russia, the case of South Africa, COVID, and so on, there's a reason why people tend to believe this information, right? Is it because they've been left aside by society for so many years that they have a need for an alternative narrative about what's going on in the world? Is it because, as Bina was saying, they've struggled economically during COVID-19 and they need a refuge, like a space that they feel protected and say, that's going to be the space where I feel comfortable because I've been so left out of all of the policy that is happening. So all of the solutions go back to trying to understand the root cause of what's creating the grievance and then targeting those instead of using patches, right? And a lot of the solutions that we see being put forward by politicians are sort of building walls against a thing that cannot be built instead of trying to understand what's making people unhappy, what's making people want to believe new narratives, what's making people distrust the media. And if we try to work on some of those solutions, that's the thing that's going to be most impactful. The biggest problem of all of that is that none of these things are going to be solving the problem right now. So you need to build trust today so that youth in 25 years, when they're not young anymore, they will consume media in the way that some of us used to consume it 15 years ago, right? The problem is that when we think about long-term solutions, nobody wants to listen because they take too long, and they're not going to have the Reddit that politicians want to get in an electoral cycle.
Thank you. Let's take one final question. Yes, please.
I was going to ask, like AI is constantly improving and the news is constantly changing. So in the future, we've already seen people's voices be sampled and they can change the narrative. So instead of misinformation, how do you think we'll end up combating that, and how will society have to adapt? But how can that be a positive thing, and we can change news with AI and technology in the future to make it more entertaining?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
Irene, I'll leave it to you. Do you have a thought?
How can AI help combat misinformation?
But also, how is it a problem? Because
Well, I mean, as we said before, a lot of the problem is that online platforms are commercial enterprises that monetize magnetize our attention, and they push to us content that kind of is controversial, that brings clicks and views. And unfortunately, they lack the moral compass at the moment to think about whether that content can be in any way harmful, and including misinformation and disinformation. So we need to have a better picture of how these algorithms operate, how they use our data. There is discussion about platforms having to be information fiduciaries, meaning using our data in responsible ways. And then this would go a long way towards us receiving information that is hopefully more reliable and more accurate. And I'd also like to make a point about the question that was asked before concerning more information from the middle, because I thought that was an interesting question. I mean, in this country, we have the idea of impartiality on public service media, for instance, that are obliged to kind of not take sides and present kind of all views in a balanced manner. So you could say that this is a way to kind of get information from the middle. It is a guarantee, but it is one that is coming increasingly under strain, because at the same time we have the online environment where there is no impartiality. People are free to be as opinionated as they want. And so broadcasters increasingly feel that their freedom of expression is stifled because of these impartiality requirements.
I can add.
Mhm.
I'm a pessimist. I don't think we're gonna resolve that. It's about technologies that are progressing every day, every year. And I mean, if the bad guys decide to, create a deep fake of you or any politician, I don't think any law in the EU is going to stop them. The only solution here is that, kind of counter AI that works to monitor that. But is it going to help a politician in the middle of the electoral campaign? No. So we are in trouble.
Yeah, but the use, just like you said, but the use of technology sometimes to identify fakes can go. It doesn't solve the problem completely, but it can help. There are now websites and software that you can use to do reverse check on some videos or some pictures, and then you can find out if they're actually true or fake, or they've been managed in some way. So we have those software and those sites, but there's a limit to which they can go to. Yeah.
On this semi-pessimistic note, it's my pleasure to thank everybody for the questions and for participating, and a great thanks to our panelists today.
Thank you.